And here's the opposite of it. I mentioned before about not leaving stubs. This is a pretty good illustration of why. So here's your branch bark collar. Here's the wound wood, and it's trying desperately to cover this over, but it just can't do it. It's too far out. It will never be able to seal over that. So here we have a situation where decay is entering into the tree and will continue to enter in, and you'll have decay in the trunk for as long as the tree is growing and could be a failure point for the tree in the future. So in summary, don't cut too far out from the branch bark collar. Don't cut into the branch bark collar. Cut just outside of it. So that's how CODIT tells us where to make our removal cuts. And that's great, except for situations where you don't have a branch bark collar, either because it's not visible. In some species, you can't see it that well. In others, if you have codominant leads, you're not going to have branch bark collars because they don't generate them. And the third circumstance is when you're doing a reduction cut. So if you're doing a reduction cut, you're not cutting the branch that's coming off the main branch, you're cutting the main branch. You're cutting it up here somewhere. So if you don't have a branch bark collar, how do you know where to make the cut? And the feature that you're going to use is called the branch bark ridge. So here's your ridge. And here it is, and here it is. It's very easy to see on virtually every species of tree. And all it is an indication of the fact that you have growth occurring from the branch, growth occurring from what it's growing from. They both have bark. And instead of the bark becoming included in creating a barrier to connection, it's being forced upwards and outwards. And you can see that ridge, kind of like a mountain being built. So how does this help us? Okay, well, here's a codominant stem. This one's codominant. This is the one you'd want to have be your lead, but there's no branch bark collar. What there is the ridge line. Okay, so here's what we're going to do with it. We're going to do a little geometry here. We're going to, in our minds, draw a line parallel with the branch that we're going to be taking off. And then we're going to draw a right angle line across the base of it, or at right angles to the parallel line with its growth. And then we have the ridge. And we're going to make our cut halfway between the two, right here. Okay. So here's the line parallel with the branch that we're taking off. Here's the right angle line. Here's the ridge. We'll cut right here. And that's where you are. So even if you don't have a branch bark collar, you're almost always going to be able to see a ridge. And that's going to help you decide where to make the cut. When you have no branch bark collar, or you can't see one, or you've got codominant leads. And here's what you do with your reduction cuts. You're not cutting this branch. This branch has a branch bark collar that would be easy to see, but there's no branch bark collar here on the branch that this one is growing from. So how do you know where to make the cut? And you're going to use the ridge again. And it's the same kind of thing. You look at a parallel line here with the branch that you're going to be reducing. You draw a right angle. You look at your ridge, and you're going to make your cut halfway between the two. And it looks like that. So there's your ridge. You have a parallel line here. You've drawn your right angle to it, and you cut right between the two. So the features of the tree tell you where to make your cuts when you're doing both removal and reduction cuts. So we talked about the cuts that we do make. Let's talk about some that we don't want to be making. And the first, of course, is topping. And fortunately, you don't see this happening much. It used to happen a fair amount. And it's, it's kind of an unscrupulous, prohibited practice now. They just made cuts willy-nilly around the tree, and you got huge cuts and lots of them all at the same time, and it's tough for the tree to survive it. When it does grow back, you get this kind of adventitious growth that's very weak. It's going to have to be cut back again because they're real stringy and they're not well connected and they're going to be breaking. So it's a lifelong job as long as the tree exists for a pruner to come back and keep doing work on it. Prohibited practice. You don't top trees except for crepe myrtle. I mean, they actually have a name for it with crepe myrtle trees because it's done routinely. It's the most common form of topping, and it isn't helping anything. It's done for 3 reasons. The main reason it's done is which is wrong. It was originally thought 30 years ago when people started doing this that if you did this to a crepe myrtle, it would improve flowering. It does not improve flowering. The second reason that it's done is because people misunderstand crepe myrtle and think it's a quote unquote small tree. And in their mind, small means, 15 feet or something like that. And the standard variety of crepe myrtle that's sold, has been being sold for the past 30 years or so, is a 30-foot tree. So often people will cut it because they thought it was going to be small, and it's not small. The third reason why it's being done is just mimicry. People see it being done to other people's crepe myrtles and think, oh, well, I need to do that with mine. So all of those are bad reasons. If your tree is too big, take it out and put in one that's the right size. Because here's what you get when you do this. You get this adventitious growth, a whole bunch of suckers popping up, and every one of them is going to flower. And what's even worse is it was all cut at the same time. They're all going to flower at the same time. And one of the great things about crepe myrtle is that down in states below us, it's referred to as the 100-day tree. In the Carolinas and Georgia, because it's warm enough there that this tree will bloom for 100 days. Different parts of the tree are blooming at different times. But when you make these cuts all at the same time, it's all going to bloom at the same time. And all the flowers are gone in 2 weeks. So bang, you had it and it's gone. So that's not too cool. And these are all sappers. They're poorly connected. They're going to break. You get these big, pendulous flowers at the ends of these tiny branches. They all bend down, don't look too good. And a lot of them break. And so it's just a crummy practice. Here's the second place where you see topping going on routinely nowadays, and that is for Bradford pear. And it's an effort to try to keep these trees from doing what they are just grown to do, which is fail. Bradford pears have a very poor structure. They were hybridized in order to meet certain goals, some of which they met, but in the process, it turned out that they all grow like this. They come up about shoulder height, and at shoulder height, they lose their lead and go in a dozen different directions, and it creates a structural weakness here. They're a short life tree. At around 40, 50 years, they start to break up. So they're being topped nowadays in order to reduce weight at the top of the tree to try to keep them from breaking. And is it valid? I don't think they've been doing this very long to know whether it's valid. It's a crummy tree. It's an invasive. I mean, cut them down and start over. Anyway, you get this junk growing up from them. I just drove past. This photo was taken 6 weeks ago, and I just drove past there the other day. I drive by it every day, unfortunately. And they'd had a pruner in again, and they cut all these off. And then they'll come in again next year and cut them all off. And it's guaranteed work for the pruners. But what did they accomplish here? It's ugly. Anyways, don't top trees. So here's a summary of the things not to do. Don't make flush cuts. When you're removing a branch from the side of the tree, don't cut it straight down. Cut it outside the branch bark collar. Don't cut too far out and leave stubs. If you have if you're working with a big mature tree that's in your yard, for instance, and it has a lower branch that you want to remove, you might think about having a pro do it. Big branches can be challenging to take off. If you're doing a reduction cut, don't cut it arbitrarily. Find a place where you've got another branch coming off that's at least a third the size and make the cut just above that. Don't take too much off the tree at one time. 25%, maybe 35%. Come back and get the rest the next year or the year after. Don't take good branches off a stress tree, or even bad branches. Leave on whatever you can during stressful times, because the tree needs every leaf it has. Don't top trees. And where you can, if you can do a reduction cut instead of a removal cut, and well structured, but just has a tip broken off it or something, try to keep it. And so much for bad practices. We're going to talk a little bit about how to cut big branches. Then we'll talk about tools and safety. So big branches. Our target as tree stewards is small trees. So we're usually making small cuts, but we might have in our own yard, or we might run into a situation where we have a bigger tree where we need to make a cut on, say, a lower branch because it's broken. You'd want to do a reduction cut on it, and it can still be pretty big even with a reduction cut. So how do we cut big branches? You can imagine, let's say you're dealing with a branch that's 4 or 5 inches around, and you've positioned yourself just outside the branch bark collar, and you've got your saw out, and you're cutting merrily away on that branch, and you get down to about halfway to 2/3 of the way through it, and what happens? It breaks like that. Okay, and it's going to split, and typically it's going to strip bark, but it breaks right into the branch bark collar, undermining the ability of the tree to grow wound wood to seal it off. So that's not how you cut a big branch. You don't do a one cut down from the top just outside the branch bark collar or anywhere on it without risking breakage like this. So they just started cutting down, and boom, it split, and it split right into the branch bark collar. So how do we avoid that? Anytime we're going to cut a branch that's too big for a hand pruner, you want to go to a saw. Yes, you can use loppers, but they're not as accurate as a hand saw. So, choose what you wish, but I tend to use, when I'm not using a hand cutter, I use a saw. And I have two options open to me. We all have two options. And that is, instead of doing a one cut down from the top, you can do what's called the 2-cut method or the 3-cut method. So let's look at the 3-cut method, which is what you use on big branches. So normally we're making our cut, as we've discussed, just outside the branch bark collar, right here. We don't want to do that with a big branch because it's very likely that it's going to split into the branch bark collar. So for our first cut, we come out a few inches from the trunk, and we're going to do an undercut. We're going to cut up under the tree, and we actually want to run our saw kind of along the opposite side, across the bottom, and around this side. We want to cut all the bark and cut into the tree maybe a little over 1/3 of the way in. You can't cut much further in, because if you do, the weight of the outside portion of the branch is going to cause it to sag, and it's going to pin your blade. You're not going to be able to get your saw out. So don't try to cut very far in, 1/3 of the way, maybe to a little less than half. Then come out a little bit further and make your second cut. And that's going to be a cut from the top down. And you'll cut down to around here, and lo and behold, what's it going to do? It's going to break. But that's okay, because you've done this undercut, and it can only break back to the point where you've cut it already. So it's just going to snap off. You're going to be left with a little stub. Excuse me. And then you come back and make your third cut, which is in the typical location just outside the branch bark collar. But all you're taking off is a stub here. You're not taking off a big, heavy branch. So that's the 3-cut method. This branch actually is smaller than you'd usually do a 3-cut on. It's usually you do this one with a 2-cut, but anyhow, just to show you how the technique works. This person is in the middle of making the third cut, the final cut, because all they have left is a stub. They made their first cut. They cut upward from the bottom of the branch. Then they went out an inch or so, cut downward. The branch broke. You're left with the stub, and they come back for their third branch at the proper location just outside the branch bark collar. That's the 3-cut method. Now, sometimes if the branch is just a little bit bigger than what you want to take on with your hand cutter, you can use what's called the 2-cut method. It's not a 4-inch branch. It's maybe 1.5 inches, 2 inches. We can use the 2-cut method, and in that, you do make your cut just outside the branch bark collar, but you start at the bottom with an undercut, come up again 1/3 to a little less than halfway, and then you cut down to it on the same plane just outside the branch bark collar. And it would look like this. So here we are making our undercut just outside the branch bark collar. Then we're cutting down to meet it on the same plane with a top cut. So this is what it would look like when you're almost done. You've done your undercut, you're matching it with your top down cut, and voila, you're done. So that's two cut, and you'd use your two cut method on fairly small branches. Once you get into anything relatively big, you're going to be doing three cut. So that brings us to a little quiz here before we get into safety and maintenance. So here's some pruning cuts that were made on three branches. So this is a Bradford pear, so you can see what a mess they are. Trunk stops here and it just goes everywhere. There's no single lead. This is an area of structural weakness. People who are doing this pruning knew this, and they're taking off the branches on this side of the tree because those branches were out over a parking area. And they know those branches are sooner or later going to break and land in somebody's car, and they're going to get sued. So they're taking off the branches that go out over the parking area. And ideally what they should be doing is cutting the tree down and planting a good tree there. But anyway, the question for you to have in mind in your little quiz here is, what cut did they use? Is this one cut, a two cut, a three cut? Was it the right cut for these branches? And keep in mind, this one is 6 inches. This is 7. This is an 8-inch branch. These are big branches. And if they didn't use the right cut, what cut should they have used? And you should be able to look at this now and tell what cut they used and whether it was the right one. So think about that for a second, and keep in mind, these are big branches, 6, 8-inch branches. Okay, so you probably figured out that they used a two-cut method. They cut up from the bottom, cut down from the top, and they couldn't get all the way through before it split. Every one of these is two cut, up from the bottom, down from the top, and they split. So these branches obviously are too big for the two cut method because they're splitting. They should have been doing three cut. But these clowns, this is where I live, and this is the grounds crew, and they really have no clue how to prune. You know, these cuts should have been made back here at the branch bark collar. Fortunately, they didn't, because if they did, these splits would have gone into the branch bark collar and they never would have healed. These are never going to heal either, but they're Bradford pears and I don't care. But they should have done three cut method.